Oh, hey, Chris.
Hey Chuck, how are you?
I am doing really well. It's Friday afternoon.
Yeah, and you should have more energy. I mean, it's been 2 weeks since our last episode dropped, so you've had a lot of time to recharge.
I've missed you. I've missed you. This is going to be hard on me.
I'm sure you'll get by. I think you'll be okay. But for all of the loyal listeners out there, Chuck and I have missed each other. Even though we're in the same building on the same floor, we're still choosing to do this over Zoom.
Well, it's convenient. You're at your desk and I'm at my desk.
That's right. That's right. So, what's new?
Oh, pretty much same old, same old. I had a couple of good cases I can share with you, and did a really interesting Hand Society webinar recently. Talk about that. What about yourself?
Yeah, so we had an interesting Hand Society Fellowship debate webinar too. So why don't we talk about your webinar? I could talk about what I talked about and the topics that came up in ours, and then maybe we could do a quick the HBR article we had talked about.
That would be awesome. So our webinar was a few weeks ago. It was, put on by the Hand Society, and it was just devoted to wrist arthroscopy. So we had a great panel. We had Sanj Kakar, who was talking about arthroscopic scapholunate reconstruction, which I'm intrigued by. I haven't done a lot of, but I think I will at least do some more work in that area. We had Jeff Yao talking about tips and pearls, which were really interesting. Lauren Shapiro from UCSF, for those of you who don't know Lauren, who trained with Jeff, was really fantastic reviewing some of the literature because many sports topics get may not be as scientifically based as exciting things like nerve.
I thought you were going to say that a lot of sports stuff ends up in different art journals, not just JHS.
Well,
But
true.
I'm not going to argue against what you're saying.
Yeah. And so we had a great conversation, and I talked a little about TFCC, so it was really fun and pretty good attendance. Those things are always hard to judge. I think we had about 100 people on, but the post webinar viewing usually is much higher. So it was very successful.
That's great. That's a pretty solid number for a weeknight and for a webinar, especially in the height of the pandemic, things were much better attended, but those are pretty solid numbers.
Yeah, I think post pandemic, those are very solid numbers. What about the fellow debate series on
Well,
cubital tunnel?
before we get to that, I mean, are there a couple of things that you took away that maybe you could share? Are you going to make everybody actually go log in and
I wa-
listen to you or get your pad your stats?
yeah, I want my stats up. Are you kidding? Um, my takeaways um, are that there really is expertise in wrist arthroscopy, and I think with experience comes valuable teachings. And I really am intrigued about arthroscopic scapholunate repair, and the concept is really almost an arthroscopic capsulodesis can have a role. When people talk about arthroscopic reconstruction, sometimes they are thinking about really difficult things that have been proposed out of Hong Kong by PC Ho and others, where you're taking a tendon graft and doing a weave. That to me sounds challenging. But these techniques, the newer techniques, really are pretty slick, and I think they probably have a nice role to play. I've harped on this before, but I'll say it again. The incidence of foveal TFCC tears with ulnar side wrist pain is higher than I ever expected. And so being aware of that pathology, looking for that pathology and treating it appropriately when found is really important. And those are the biggest two, but I would say that we are slowly making progress in our understanding of wrist pathology to how to treat it in a minimally invasive and effective way.
Very nice. Is there any newer techniques in terms of stabilizing those foveal tears aside from what you've been doing the last couple of years with the ulnar tunnel type technique?
There aren't that I'm aware of, but there probably do need to be. The ulnar tunnel is good. I've honestly had a few failures, although I've had many successes. So there, and I do sometimes do a variation where I really like, this is going to date me, but I really like the meniscus mender 2 set, which is made by Smith and Nephew, which was the original One
Do
of
they
the
still make it,
original.
or are they still selling down the supply that they made back in 1982?
Maybe the latter, but it's what I only used to use for outside in repairs, but I do use that to supplement sometimes the foveal repairs because you can slip that needle either through your tunnel or right around the ulnar styloid, and it's inexpensive and it works really well. But I think there probably are still advances to be made with effectiveness and durability of repair.
Now, not to hold you to this at a scientific peer-reviewed level, but anecdotally, what are the reasons why you think some of the ulnar tunnel repairs fail?
I suppose it is because while we can reattach through this tunnel with a nice solid suture, the TFCC back down to the ulna, we're asking a lot. And so if that doesn't have the chance to really heal back to bone, the TFCC back to bone, and again, I think we're asking a lot, it can fail. And I think it's that simple. So that's why sometimes I put two sutures hoping to minimize that, but there may be better techniques out there. The trick, of course, is you don't want to just plaster the TFC down to the head of the ulna because then you'll lose rotation. So it is a little bit of a trick of secure fixation without limitation of motion.
Right. And do you think it's how much of that is tunnel placement versus, post-op protocols, or just, maybe you don't ever get it down enough?
All fair. I don't think we have. That's why one of the reasons I'm excited about the work that you are aware of, that one of our fellows, Dr. Wright, and I are getting ready to embark on looking at DRUJ stability and trying to quantify it in a way that the knee surgeons quantify translation of the tibia on the femur. I think it has real potential to really providing some data regarding stability because we right now it's all sense of feel and we are terrible at.
I remember when this will date me, but when I was a medical student working on projects in medical school, one of the things that was going on in that lab was trying to use, tech scan sensors on the skin and assessing and quantifying DRUJ stability and on the carpal stability, and trying to get a handle on that. So I'm glad that the field has advanced substantially in the, 3 or 4 years since I graduated med school.
You're not as young as you like to make yourself out to be anymore, Dr. D. But
One of our fellows asked me today what year I graduated high school, and she's like, "Oh, oh." And then I asked her when she graduated high school, and I was like, "I graduated from med school that year." I was like, "Shit."
So wait, so your attempts to quantify DREJ translation were unsuccessful all those years ago?
They were unpublished. There was quantification, but there was a lot of challenges in getting. It wasn't a project I was involved in, but I always heard about it during the lab meetings. So I was like, "Man, that project's still around, huh?"
Uh-oh. You just
So I'm sure
scared me.
there's a wealth of data out there that might beat you and David Wright to the scoop. It might
Uh-oh.
scoop you guys, beat you to the punch.
We'll keep it on the down low. We won't talk about it on a podcast or anything.
Yeah, exactly. You won't tell thousands and thousands of your loyal listeners and fans Chuck Goldfarb.
That's right. Well, tell me about your webinar.
Well, before I do, we have to thank our sponsors because we oftentimes forget and sometimes have to go back and reinsert some new copy. But The Upper Hand is sponsored by PracticeLink.com, the most widely used physician job search and career advancement resource.
Becoming a physician is hard. Finding the right job doesn't have to be. Join Practice Link for free today at www.practicelink.com/the upper hand. And I think you and I we're planning to potentially meet with the owner and discuss some different strategies that might be helpful for building their network of physicians that are interested. Because I really do believe in what they are doing and the goals of the organization.
Absolutely. And just for those of you that are listening, I think this episode is going to drop about 3 weeks before the AAOS meeting in Las Vegas. I believe Practice Link will have a presence there on the floor because they did ask if you and I wanted to record live, Chuck. I told them I don't think we're both available at the same time because I don't think we are. But they did say something about having Chuck Goldfarb wearing a Practice Link hat and signing some kind of swag. So if those of you that are listening are going to be at the AOS and want to start a petition to get Chuck to have some autograph time, please reach out. Handpodcast@gmail.com. I'll sign a petition.
Oh
I'll bring
Lord.
Chuck some stuff to sign.
Oh Lord. I am going to be in Vegas, but honestly, I'm not really planning to attend the meeting. I have some other things going on. But
Oh,
now
the man has other things going on. He's in Vegas.
What stays in what happens in Vegas? You know the old saying, Dr. D.
Oh yes, well there is the American Orthopedic Association has that executive committee meeting that I'm sure you'll be attending as well. So yes, I'm very excited about that trip. I think it'll be a fun meeting. But anyway, yes. So we had the fellowship debate series. Latest edition was on cubital tunnel syndrome. That was just last night. Our fellowship was well represented by our own David Wright, who apparently is all over the place because he's working with you. But he gave a great talk last night, and he was mentored by our partner David Brogan. There was a representative from Hospital for Special Surgery. Aaron Kim was mentored by Dan Osei, our former partner. And Lee Osterman's group from Philly Hansen was represented by Tristan Weir. And Jeremy Raduca was representing Duke and mentored by Sahil Mathani. So it was a good talk. Each of them presented they had assigned topics. I presented a revision cubital tunnel case, and there was a discussion about why it should be an intramuscular transposition. There was one about why you should do the adipofascial flap, which I'm sure you were all about. They do it a little differently at Duke than they do than how Rosenwasser described it. And then David talked about why we shouldn't wrap nerves, which I think was super interesting. I know that we do have some of our industry partners that listen to this. It was a balanced discussion, I promise, about the pros and cons of wrapping. But it ended up that many of the faculty on surgeons on the call do not use wraps widely. And then there was a discussion about supercharging and the argument to supercharge and when it's appropriate. So there's some good topics that came up. I mean, one of the, at the end we were having a discussion, and one of them was about how to minimize postoperative scarring or adhesions around the nerve, especially in a revision setting. So Chuck, do you have any pearls on that? I can share some of the stuff that was shared by the faculty.
It's a really interesting question, which I know your life is one-dimensional. It's nerve, nerve, nerve. But I will say that, we talk about it in congenital hand surgery, and not to put a plug in, but I am going to put a plug in. We have this major meeting, international meeting, which happens once every 3 years. It is in May in Minneapolis. So we're hosting the entire world. And at this meeting, there's going to be some really interesting talks. And one of our keynotes is by a physician named Michelle Griffin, and actually she's a PhD on the role of mechanics in skin wound repair and fibrosis. And there is progress with controlling scar formation, and it is much needed because the only thing that I know to do is move patients. I don't know what else to do, but I hope you're going to enlighten me right now.
Well, that's actually where, well, first off, that's a great meeting. Here's Chuck again plugging his own programming, by the way. That will be a great meeting. That was delayed once because of the pandemic, right?
Yeah, so it happened. I've been in 2012, 2015, 2018. We got delayed from 2021 to 2023. And so there's pent-up demand for congenital content, Dr. D.
Triennial Congress of sorts is what we're calling this.
Absolutely. Thank you. You're
Oh,
making it
man.
sound important.
I'm sure it's going to be great. One of our fellows, Kelsey Overman, is going to be attending. She's totally jazzed about it. So I brought up the motion thing, and I was very surprised that some of the surgeons in the group moved their patients very early. So there was one surgeon who said soft dressing moved the day of surgery. The other one said that they also moved the day of surgery, although they used a splint and got him out of the splint. I'm at the 3-day mark, which I think I think we talked about on the podcast before. And then there were others who were a little bit slower to move patients. So I think that there's a lot of variability there, but that's probably one of the big things that's going to help. There was discussion about whether using a wrap of various sorts. There was definitely. I don't think we're lumping all the wraps into one. I think that certainly autologous is different than a synthetic wrap like a PGA or a bovine or porcine product. And then the amniotic wraps may have an interesting role too. I know one of our listeners and friends, Rob Gray, reports some very enthusiastic anecdotes regarding the amniotic wrap. So I think that is an option. I certainly have not seen enough data to convince me to use that. But the one thing that really came up and people really resonated was the importance of hemostasis.
That is a really good point and is really fair. I know that at least one of our partners places a drain with ulnar nerve transposition. I
Yeah,
do not.
that's me. That's me.
Oh, then
I'm your
maybe
partner
it's.
that does that.
I'm so sorry for your
You know,
patience.
hey, so there's some really great episodes on cubital tunnel, Chuck. I don't know if you know that there's a podcast about hand surgery.
Oh
The
my
most
God.
downloaded episodes are about cubital tunnel.
I just assumed you'd moved on from there. Now, all right, so I totally agree. Hematomas are bad, and I'm very meticulous on the way in, but I do not let down the tourniquet or place a drain. And I don't, to my knowledge, in the last few years, and I can't remember much past that, I haven't had a major hematoma, but I think it's a very fair statement and maybe worth considering a change in practice for me.
Yeah, you'll consider it and then you'll say, no, I'm good.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think it's personally, I think it's an important thing. I like to get a sense of how things are looking once the transposition's done. I don't do it for a subcutaneous transposition though. I think that it's more likely to have kind of that continuous oozing after you've worked through the flexor pronator mass if you do a submuscular transposition, or even if you do an intramuscular, in fact, you're working through some of the muscle. And then you tend to get those really pesky vessels by the septum too if you're not careful, if you're doing any transposition. But yeah, I think hemostasis, as one of my former mentors and a current tumor surgeon, I believe she's at Hopkins now, Carol Morris says, hemostasis starts with the approach. And that's a surgical principle I've lived by since training with Dr. Morris.
I love that. I haven't actually heard it stated that way, but it is certainly a truism.
I feel like orthopedic oncologists, or maybe it's tumor surgeons in general, just have such great one-liners and aphorisms. I mean, and that was one of them.
It's good. It's definitely good. Well, it sounds
But
like
we
a
should,
great webinar.
yeah, it was really fun. I think it honestly that the conversation could have carried on a lot longer. We started to get into the discussion about whether ultrasound is helpful for revision cases and what the role of that is, and then the role of the old role of the in situ decompression. There's a lot of talk about the real revision rate after that, and it's very different. Lee claims to have a 2% revision rate based on the paper that he wrote. We know Dan's paper from here demonstrated a 20%. And if you look at and we know the paper that you originally wrote with Dr. Mansky was around 7%. So we know that the populations are very different in each of those papers. So I think it's not apples to apples, but the revision rate's probably somewhere in between.
Absolutely. All right, we should maybe talk about a case or two.
Yeah, why don't we do our cases? And do you want to save that? Do you want to save the cases for our next episode?
Okay, let's save the cases, a little teaser there, and let's talk Harvard Business Review.
Is that a question?
It's I need some affirmation. Is that the
Yeah,
plan?
so let's talk about this HBR article that you emailed me probably at some ungodly hour in the morning. But it's called How to Work with a Workaholic Colleague. The author is Melody Wilding. And I don't have the HBR reprint number in front of me, but it's not for some reason included here. But it was published on February 1st of this year.
Yeah, the title caught me because some, might confuse me for one of those workaholics, Dr. D. And I thought maybe I could learn something, but I also thought there would be practical advice. And there is. I think it's not a complex topic, but in the sense of how do you deal with a workaholic colleague? But I think it's useful because in medicine, whether it be private practice or academic practice, there will be varying efforts, and certainly the old school classic surgeon that overworks it exists everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And I think probably to set the stage, I will read the first paragraph of the article because I think it's a good way to set it up. So it says, your colleague is the first one in and the last one to leave. They volunteer to take on every additional task that comes your team's way, and they respond to emails within minutes. They're working all the time, whether from the office or from home. In short, you're dealing with a workaholic. While it's tough reporting to a workaholic boss, having a hard-driving peer who seems married to the job can be equally frustrating. So let's say it's not your boss or your executive vice chair, but it's your partner and somebody at work who just seems to always be working. How does that strike you? I mean, like you said, I think many of us in surgery, medicine, therapy, healthcare, you're clearly driven to a certain point to get to this stage. And those habits don't die hard or don't die easily. They're hard to die. So how do you divorce like what got you here and what's going to get you to the next place?
I think the one advantage that we have in our complex worlds is we really don't have line of sight into each other's lives. And I think that's good. Like, I have no idea when you came into work this morning. I have no idea when you're going home and what you're going to accomplish during this day. At the end of the year, I certainly see metrics, but I, that's not something I really live by, as opposed to an office setting where people are coming and going. So I think our medical world is different than some of the other worlds, but you kind of see emails, and we can talk about the appropriateness of sending after hour emails and weekend emails. I've thought a lot about that, and we've talked about it, but I think it's the bottom line is you have to just try to do your own thing, but that can be easier said than done.
Well, I think that's one of the take homes of the article is really understanding that they're doing their thing and you're doing your thing, and you need to not be lulled into, well, I've got to be like they're being, because a workaholic may be a workaholic for a number of different reasons. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to one up you or put you down. You just need to lean into the fact that that's not your choice and that's not how you want to approach work. And just say, all right, these are my boundaries. This is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do certain things off hours, and I'm not going to have the same behaviors, which honestly can be very hard, because I think that when I read this article, it reminded me of residency, and having to keep up with a very very talented and driven and smart and competitive group of peers who I love. And we had a great bond, but it was a tough group to keep up with.
Yeah, and there's some value, especially if it's during residency, for example, driving you to be your best, maybe pushing too hard, but once it becomes the rest of your life, that's difficult. I'm going to read a little bit more. There's a difference between working hard and being emotionally dependent on your job. Motivation separates a coworker who's engaged from one who's obsessed. Workaholics feel an internal compulsion to give the business their all and can't turn off. Instead, they think about professional matters off hours at the expense of their personal life and relationships. That's the danger, right?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think that as something I've been thinking about a lot recently is kind of the existential question of like what's worth it in your life, and like what's when do you what role should work be in your fulfillment. And obviously that's not something that is binary. It's certainly something that has a spectrum in terms of you'll need to be able to turn it on and off at certain amounts as you progress in your career and as your family life changes. But it is being always on and having work be a heavy part of your emotional fulfillment, is certainly a recipe for what we talk about a lot, which is burnout.
Right. And I'm in an interesting stage, not to get too personal, when everyone talks about the classic midlife crisis, which really may have always meant burnout. And when your kids go off to college, you have an empty nest, and it's time to reassess things. That's what you look at. You look at kind of what is your work-life balance and friends and all those kind of things. And we can talk ad nauseum about those things, but trying to find the right balance, and your balance and my balance and the next person's balance is going to look different. And that's okay. And again, that's one of the central take-home messages.
Right. I think it's interesting that you reframe the midlife crisis as burnout, because I think, it's probably is a better way of looking at it. Generationally, things have certainly changed, but I don't think that's one. I think that's also important to recognize that everybody's balance or rhythm is different in terms of work and personal life, but also your own rhythm will change. And it's about recognizing that you are evolving, you are changing over time, and that's something that you need to pay attention to. And that's, I think that an honest assessment and reappraisal, tempting to do at the beginning of the year because of the New Year's stuff, but or an academic year. But I think that's an important thing to do and something that I'm trying to rededicate myself towards.
Yeah, it is not easy. It is, I certainly will say, I feel like it is okay to work really hard. It is okay to put in a lot of hours. But if you have a family, the trick is being 100% on when you're with your family. And as we, again, have also discussed, when do you find time for yourself outside of work and outside of family? And, that may be getting up early to exercise, which I swore I'd never do. And I was on the Peloton way too early this morning. And that's okay, though. It gives me energy instead of taking energy away. And so we, all of us can make it work. It's just depending on finding a way to be on in all your activities.
Right. And that's one of those things that's easier said than done in terms of, when you're with family, being completely with family, being completely present. Because that's one of the things about this workaholic article is that, the workaholic lets those work related things seep into all parts of their life and is pervasive. And honestly, it is really hard to turn it off when you're when you're not at work and you're supposed to be with family and doing your self-care time, whatever it is. But I think it is trying to find some way to do that. But it is super hard to do. I certainly don't have any, I can't say I'm an expert at it.
Yeah, I guess I'd be interested in your strategy. So, we work hard here, not passing judgment on other institutions, but, put in a long day. I'm trying to be better about, I try to finish my email before I go home, and then I may have a few more to clean up. I'm trying to do my research activities during the daytime at work or at selective hours on the weekend, typically before the family wakes up, trying to avoid going home and just opening the computer, which I have been guilty of, but try to control.
Yeah, I've really tried to avoid that, and obviously there are going to be exceptions to that, like when you're doing a webinar or something, you're gonna have to. But yeah, I've tried to be good about that. But there are just times where, especially with like the pandemic and during that work from home time and more flexibility and stuff for those of us that do academic work and those lines just get very blurred. It was much easier before to draw a very clear line, but there are times where I would just rather be home and around. But then also I know that being home and around, there's the expectation that I am home and I am there with them, not necessarily working. It's kind of hard to explain that to at least at this stage a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yeah, for sure. Should we, it won't take long, but you want to go through some of the specific recommended actions?
Yeah, they talked about depersonalizing the actions of your workaholic colleague. They use some very fancy social psychology term here called the fundamental attribution error, but and I'll skip their definition of it. But it says here, in other words, your colleague is probably not overworking to intimidate or one-up you, and debias your thinking by considering other reasons for their behavior. Perhaps your colleague is going through something personally or is throwing themselves into work as an escape, or maybe they are reacting to a past workplace trauma.
There's a lot there. But the
Yep.
bottom line is let them do their thing and you do yours.
And there's probably a reason why, right? And I think that and you and I have talked about this, I think personally, not necessarily in the context of the podcast, we don't give other people the benefit of the doubt enough. Like maybe they just have some stuff they're going through and they just need to throw themselves into work to ignore everything else that's going on. And this is their way of coping. And they're not trying to put you down by working more hours or, doing whatever else. This is just what they need right now. And we just assume that we assume that we understand their intentions, and we probably have no idea.
Right. And I think I have learned that lesson and then had to relearn it and relearn it and relearn it, and is give people the benefit of the doubt and assume best intentions and make them prove you really wrong before you give up on that.
Right, right. And I'm sure that it's probably a leadership lesson that you have to live every day.
Well, we all should. Number two, avoid glorifying the behavior. Um, that's a little tricky because you want to be a good partner, you want to be a good coworker. But the example is if you know your colleague stayed up all night creating a presentation, for example, complimenting their sacrifice can be counterproductive. Um, Interesting. I mean, if it's a good presentation, it's a good presentation, but I understand the point.
Yeah, I understand the point. I think that that's probably outside of the context of what we do deal with in kind of a healthcare, setting. But I think that there are times where we can monitor our own behavior, and even if we're criticizing somebody for something, we shouldn't be um, doing the same thing. So it talks to the next paragraph about, if you're criticizing somebody about being a workaholic, maybe you shouldn't be sending emails on Saturday night at 10 p.m., for example. And even if you're clearing out your inbox because you think that's a good thing for you, maybe time your messages to go out on Monday morning, which I've often thought about, but I've never quite figured out exactly how to do.
So I'll be honest, I've thought a lot about it because especially when I mean, I don't think I mean, I should think about it with every email, but I think more about it with staff and I don't want people to feel like they have to respond. It's not the sending of the email, and I'm certainly not trying to send any messaging about my work hours, but I think it's the probably, and I don't expect a return email. And I've actually seen bylines in emails saying the timing of this email does not reflect an expectation to respond. But the point is, should we just time our emails? It actually, Outlook makes it super simple. I do it occasionally. And maybe you just shouldn't send emails after 6 p.m. or on the weekends. Maybe you just time them.
Yeah, no, I think that we have a sense we want to clear our head, clear our inbox. A lot of us use our inbox as our to-do list. That's what I do. Um, but it's also like somebody's going to read something and it's going to have even a split second effect on them. And sometimes there is that little dopamine hit of just like replying and being done with it. But then it's like that repetitive dopamine hit just keeps adding up, and then all of a sudden you're no longer watching your kid's soccer game. Uh, you know, that's human nature.
It's human nature. The next one is resist
But
peer pressure.
apparently timing your emails is very simple, so I should probably try a little harder.
It is simple. You should play with it. The next one is resist peer pressure. And I think that's the real danger here. Trying to keep up, trying to avoid questioning your work effort. I think that a lot of that depends on if you have a boss, how your boss may see your work effort being validated and how you're handling things would help with that. But that's the trick here for me.
Yeah, I think it is really knowing thyself and setting your own, they talk next about setting boundaries, but it's knowing what you want to do, what you're willing to do, and just saying, look, like that's what you do, this is what I do. And that can be hard at times especially if you're early on in your career. It's hard to understand, how you can maintain your confidence, but also still feel like you're going to be valued in the same way.
Yeah, love it, love it. Yeah, so the setting boundaries is hard. I think it's a matter of certainly if there is a power differential, it can be really hard to set boundaries. But I think that is an admirable goal. And as the author mentions, it may initially be met with resistance, but hopefully over time, um, your colleague will understand.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is, for example, one of those things is like if somebody sends you a paper and says, I need this back by tomorrow, if you want to be an author, it's not reasonable. And I think that most people, if they were step back from the situation, would say that's completely unreasonable. It's just a matter of feeling like you have the ability to say, okay, next time, like I'm happy to do this. I need a little more time, and the next time I need at least a certain amount of time, 3 days a week or whatever, in order um, to do that. I hope, I think there's a way to do that, and to do it intentionally, but still in a very collegial way.
Yeah, it's a good example. It's a very good example. This has been fun. I've missed our HBR discussions. It's been a while.
Yes, it's a hit in terms of when people talk about, what they like about the podcast. Whenever I see some of our fans at meetings, I ask them what they like about the podcast, and they say Chuck, and then they say sports, and then they say, oh yeah, the HBR articles are pretty good.
You are funny. You are funny. All right. Well, this has been fun, and I'd like to talk again soon, but I'll try to wait a full 2 weeks before getting back together with you.
Yeah, I think we should do that, and fully expect to see another Saturday 5 a.m. email from you. So
I'm learning, Dr. D. I'm always learning. I may look old, but I'm not too old to learn.
Have a good one.
You too.